The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is my favorite entry in the Zelda series, and my second favorite video game just in general. The game is often criticized for how similar it is to Ocarina of Time, but that's unironically what makes it so good in my opinion. It is the peak of the classic Zelda formula, taking every aspect of that formula, fine-tuning smaller issues, removing the fluff, and really just being a condensed Zelda experience. Obviously, it has its issues, and I'm not trying to pretend that it's perfect or anything, but overall the highs are really high, and the lows are almost just minor bumps in the road. So let's get into the game and why I love it so much. But first, the superfluous fluff. Twilight Princess has what is easily my least favorite art style in the entire series. It's not terrible, but compared to the other games, it has these little things that pile up into not looking that great. And I'm not just talking about graphics either, obviously those are going to age, but rather the art style itself. I actually really like everything that has to do with the Twilight Realm, particularly these Twilight beasts that you need to fight to open up warp points. They look really cool and creepy, but everything else? The game is washed out, which has always confused me since Majora's Mask, the darkest Zelda game as everyone knows, was actually pretty colorful, so why this game couldn't be just a little more saturated is beyond me. Outside of Link, Zelda, and Renato, I guess, the humans are just too goofy looking. It works well with Malo, but he's really the only exception. These are my least favorite enemy designs in the entire series. They're nasty and really ugly looking, and while it was most certainly on purpose, it doesn't mean I have to like it. They don't feel like real creatures like in the rest of the 3D games. They feel like enemies that you need to fight. Meanwhile, the music is actually pretty good. The Wind Waker has some really incredible tunes like Dragon Roost Island or that theme that plays during the opening explaining the backstory of the flooding of Hyrule, but for the most part it was pretty unremarkable. Twilight Princess is in the same camp as Wind Waker in that regard, but I find myself vibing to the music a lot more here. There's an equal mix of upbeat and cheery songs and the darker, more somber themes, and that mix is pretty solid. The darker themes are definitely my favorite in the game. I love the Twilight theme. It's kind of soothing in a weird sort of way while simultaneously putting me a little on edge. It's a really strange experience listening to it for me, honestly. I also really like how they used Ocarina of Time's music in this game. The songs played on the ocarina are used with the Howling Stones, and while none of them sound as good as the original pieces, they're fresh enough to justify being used, even if it is just nostalgia bait. Then you have songs like Sacred Grove, which is my favorite Lost Woods theme in the series. It's just so peaceful and relaxing, which I prefer when compared to Ocarina, where the music is more upbeat and energetic. Both sound great obviously, but I prefer Twilight Princess's take on it much more. The game also has the best Overworld theme. It's got the heroic qualities from Ocarina and the adventurous feeling from the Wind Waker, and I just think that it's a far better composition than both of those. But the best theme in the game is, surprise surprise, Midna's Lament. Whilst the annoying battle theme ruins the atmosphere hard, the theme has a sense of desperation that is required from that section of the game. It's also just a nice song to listen to and has similar qualities to the Song of Healing, even if not as good. The game, despite being made on the same engine as the Wind Waker, somehow got the controls all fricked up. I swear there are moments when Link will just jump into a pit or some lava or whatever when the player clearly didn't do that. Basically, whenever you center the camera while moving, the direction you're holding the stick will be forward until you reorient yourself. If you're holding right when recentering the camera, then right becomes forward, same with left and back as well. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea or how it was implemented, but it can make playing the game needlessly frustrating sometimes. It's not a massive deal breaker and it doesn't detract from the game's status as favorite Zelda or anything, but it is still an issue with the game that needs to be brought up, I feel. Then you have the game's big gimmick, Wolf Link. While I think that the idea has potential, the game really doesn't do much with that idea. The biggest gameplay addition that he has are the Tears of Light, which I will talk about later. He can sense things, but the only really interesting thing that they do with that are the Centrails. He can also talk to animals, which is an interesting way of getting more perspective on the world, but not much else. The combat with Wolf Link gets worse as the game progresses as well, seeing as how you get more combat moves and the wolf combat stays the same throughout the game. There's not much else to say about him, which is kind of surprising considering that he is taking up literally half of the box art. Getting a bit more positive, they finally started to improve the combat in 3D Zelda with this game. The base combat is basically the same, but there are a bunch of hidden skills hidden throughout the overworld. These really spice up the combat and make it feel less mundane. The only one that you are forced to learn is the ending blow, which allows you to kill enemies before they get back up, which really speeds encounters since you don't have to wait for them to get back up after you knock them over. There's also the shield attack, which stuns the enemies for a split second, but it's not really that useful on its own. The back slice is pretty useful and it adds a bit of momentum to combat encounters. The Elm Splitter is used in tandem with the shield attack, and the only reason the shield attack is useful in my opinion. Once again, it adds momentum to combat encounters, and because it's a lot swifter to engage with this skill compared to the backslice, it's usually the one that I use a lot more. The Mortal Draw is alright. It's really not that useful, and it's probably the most forgettable hidden skill. I don't think that I ever use it after learning it a single time in any of my playthroughs. The Jump Strike takes too long to charge up, meaning that it's not really that useful unless you're in a one-on-one counter, and even then, it's just easier to use any of the other skills. There's the Great Spin, which is literally just a more powerful spin attack that can only be used if at full health. It's definitely useful, but just kind of strange that the final hidden skill you learn is essentially an upgrade when the rest were legitimate moves that you could now perform, but whatever. These skills are a better evolution than in Wind Waker, since that one was based on button prompts, which didn't really do much other than simplify the combat. Here you don't wait for the button prompt, you engage the button prompt, which makes the combat flow much better and gives the player much more control over combat encounters. It fits with that classic 3D Zelda combat while still advancing it in a natural way. Insert natural transition to the next section here. Twilight Princess has a huge overworld. It's usually criticized for being barren, which I have never really understood. Twilight Princess isn't anywhere near the same levels of empty as Ocarina of Time. Unlike something like Breath of the Wild, the world here is split up into chunks. These chunks have the bare minimum amount of content required of them, but it's better than nothing, I guess. In Ocarina of Time, the actual field had practically nothing to do in it. Sure, there was the occasional Poe or Golden Skulltula, but for the most part it was used to create space in between the primary locations. Here though, there are quite a few things to find in the field itself, which makes it feel more connected to the rest of the areas in the game. The field is only filled with optional collectibles however, with the only real thing for the main quest that you need to do is find some Malo statues. And I'll talk about said collectibles a bit later. For now, let's talk about the content located within locations outside of Hyrule Field. Everything is split up into different provinces, each one ranging in quality in terms of how fun it is to traverse and how much content it offers. Your Ardona province is the first one in the game, and it doesn't really have that much to do outside of the opening. There's a goat herding minigame on the ranch that's not that fun, the village itself where there really isn't that much stuff to do outside of the opening, and the woods, which is basically a short path with a spring at the end of it. You do get a few important items here like the fishing rod you only ever need to use one time afterwards, but there's really not that much to it. It's the tutorial area of the game, so I give it a pass though. The Faron province has a few things of interest. Firstly are the woods, which are a little too lacking with what you do there considering that it's basically just a straight line. There's a swamp, which is just the path to the forest temple, but there is actually something notable about it, and that is the Sacred Grove, which is the worst take on the Lost Woods of any of the 3D games. Firstly, there are the never-ending respawning puppets, which are really annoying, and end up making trying to find Skull Kid unreasonably irritating. Secondly, the navigation isn't interesting like in Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, because it is impossible to get lost. Paths even close behind you, ensuring that you can't get lost, which ends up making the whole thing less interesting and really boring. Finding Skull Kid takes no effort at all since you just have to listen for his horn in the right section. He also goes to the same spot every time, which hurts replayability. Then you have this Josh Forsaken part. Listen, I want to ensure that I do get monetized, that small things like this don't ruin me, so sorry for the cringe. Anyway, this Josh Forsaken part makes me so unbelievably angry. So you're trying to hit the Skull Kid, but you're surrounded by puppets who are constantly attacking you and chipping away your health, so while it seems simple enough to do, it isn't. Maybe I'm just bad at video games, but this part just drains my soul. And don't get me started on this stupid puzzle. This is the one part of any Zelda game outside of the first one where using a guide leads to a better experience. Because then you don't have to waste hours of your life making stupid mistakes that you can't take back, leading to more annoyance as you try to course correct, but end up making things worse otherwise. It's a fine enough puzzle, but it's just so difficult to try and figure out that it loses any semblance of fun it might have had. The Eldin province has quite a bit of things to do. There's Kakariko Village, which has a pretty interesting design compared to the towns in previous games, with it feeling more built into the mountainside. However, at least for me, the design makes it kind of easy to overshoot a building that you wanted to walk into, and the signs aren't really that helpful since they aren't facing a useful direction, and they aren't even in front of the building, they're off to the side. The graveyard also doesn't have as much stuff as Ocarina. In that game, there were some cool secrets to uncover, but here there's just some bugs and the Zora armor. There's Death Mountain, which isn't as interesting as it was in Ocarina of Time. Surprise, surprise, you pretty much only ever need to come here after leaving the Goron Mines. There's the Hidden Village, which is a decently fun little section where you clear out all the Bulbins infesting the area. It can be a little tedious sometimes, but it's still fun regardless. There's also a bridge you can repair a little later in the game so that you can get to Castletown if for some reason you decided not to warp there. There's also a couple of fights with King Bulbin that I'll talk about later here. Along with that, there's this wagon escort mission. It's fine. I remember that I couldn't stand it when playing the GameCube version of the game, and quite honestly, I don't really know why. It can be kind of annoying when you're trying to kill the Bulblin archers on horseback, but it's a nice little adrenaline rush before the next dungeon otherwise. The Peak Province, or whatever it's called, is the one with the least amount of stuff to do. There's nothing outside of the main quest here, so it's a linear path with no branches or opportunities to explore. The path is decently interesting, though until you meet up with Yeto, it's kind of underwhelming. The snowboarding section here is really fun though, and the highlight of an otherwise desolate location. The Desert Province, or Gerudo Desert if you're not a heathen, is the worst section of the map by far. First off, it's completely disconnected from every other section of the map, with the only way to get there being launching yourself from a cannon or warping. You can't use Epona here, so you have to walk agonizingly slowly if you want to get anywhere for the first time since you first entered Hyrule Field. And even then, that section was very small and didn't take too long where you needed to go. You have to wait for these things to slowly make their way over to you so you can grab onto it with your hookshot, then wait for it to slowly move over the chasm. There's hardly any gold bugs to find, and there's just so much emptiness, especially when compared with the rest of the map, where there's a little bit of stuff to do everywhere. There's the Gerudo Mesa, which has approximately 2 things to do: get a Poe Soul and repair the Elden Bridge. The Cave of Ordeals is located here, but I'm not really a combat kind of guy, and the only time I've ever enjoyed one of these types of gauntlets was with Breath of the Wild's Trial of the Sword. And this is not that, so I don't particularly enjoy it. The most substantial thing here is the Bulbin Fortress, and surprisingly, it's not as good as Ocarina or Majora's fortresses. Those ones were stealth-based, but not really with this one. You just kind of wander around killing enemies until you make it to King Bulbin with another fight. There's no tricky navigation or worry that you'll be caught. It lacks that oomph that the previous games had. The Lanayru province is probably the densest area of the game. The primary location here is Lake Hylia, and even that is split up into smaller areas. There's a couple of caverns that lead to a few goodies, Zora's Domain, which is one of the least impressive looking iterations in the series, considering that it's basically just a small circular room. There's the upper portion of the river, which houses the glorious fishing minigame and the boating minigame. There's the lower section of the river, which houses the temple itself, the clown cannon attraction, I guess, and the river itself connecting these two locations together. And I hate that you need to use the pointer in order to traverse it. There's literally no reason for it. The analog stick works just fine. I don't get why they needed to shove in the Wii's motion controls into something that could have so easily and effortlessly been done when using the analog stick. Luckily, they did learn their lesson and didn't double down on garbage like this. There's also this ledge that leads back into the field. However, that's not the only thing that this region has to offer, as Castletown is also located here. Instead of involving like 2 side quests and a lame stealth section, there's actually quite a bit to do here. It's split up into 4 main sections instead of being just one main section and an alleyway. There's the central square and the south, east, and west roads. There's the sewers that connect the town to the castle, which aren't really that fun to navigate, but they're short, so it's really not worth complaining about. There are a few mini games and shops, as one would expect. A fortune teller who can offer tips as to where heart pieces are and what you need to do next if you're stuck. It is a little too out of the way to be legitimately useful to new players though. I for one never discovered this building until my second playthrough. There's Agatha's Castle, which is where you dispense the golden bugs you've collected throughout the game. I will say that it's kind of weird that you get the wallet upgrades from here and that you also only get the wallet after she gives you a ton of rupees. I like Chudley's Fine Goods and Fancy Trinkets Emporium. It's pretty funny a shop with the ridiculous prices of the items. It's pretty memorable, especially after you finish investing in the Malo Mart stuff. There's Giovanni, and I love everything about him, an observation deck where the only thing that's really notable is the reference to the first Zelda game. Finally, there's Telma's Bar, where the only notable thing is its connection to the main plot. There's this resistance group, which is an interesting idea that they don't really do anything with. The most that happens with them is someone has a book that you need to collect sky letters for, and they kill a couple of enemies on a bridge towards the end of the game. There are two things that hold the overworld together and make it so much better than any of the other previous 3D Zeldas: the collectibles and the traversal. Let's start with the collectibles. There's the standard art pieces, and here it's a lot more Metroidvania-like. There's not much to say about them as per usual, though there is one thing that I really like about how they were implemented, and that's with the dungeons. It doesn't really replace Skulltulas from Ocarina, but they're fine enough change to warrant going out of your way to go for chests in the dungeons. There are the hidden skills, which I talked about earlier, but I never did talk about the collection process. There are a bunch of howling stones you can find across the land, and after that you get the location of where you need to go to actually learn the skills. It's not like that other game where you have to fuse stones and afterwards need to trek over to get your treasure. It was already simple enough to activate the stone, so it doesn't feel like a waste of time in order to get the skill. Golden bugs are basically this game's version of the golden Skulltulas from Ocarina of Time. There are only 24 throughout the whole game, and since they're spread out through a 15-ish hour game, it's something that is actually pretty rewarding to collect all of. It is kind of annoying that you can't easily find them in the daytime, especially considering that for some reason there's no way to change the time of day like in previous Zelda games. The audio cue doesn't really help with finding them, though otherwise they're pretty fun to collect. The Poes are a pretty big step up from Ocarina. The reward isn't a bottle like last time, but it's not like the actual reward is that much better. The Great Fairies here doesn't really give you much that's actually helpful considering how easy the combat is, but the ease in which you can find the Poes in this game makes up for that. Whenever you're near a Poe, it is painfully obvious, and there are a lot more than 10 in this game, and it feels like they are everywhere. It is a little annoying that you have to be a wolf in order to defeat them, but otherwise they're alright. It is a little weird that you can only start hunting them down after the first third of the game, but I guess it makes sense considering Arbiter's Grounds is the next dungeon, and the player would need to know how to actually beat them. But on the other hand, it doesn't really make sense why they wouldn't be able to be beaten earlier at that point. It isn't an issue, just something to pad out the runtime of this video. Whilst I didn't have that much to say about the collectibles, they are a big part of what makes this world so much fun to explore. Without it, you have another generally barren and boring to traverse overworld. The ease at which you traverse the world is what really ties the whole experience together. Epona is decently fast, and crossing the map is no issue with her, especially considering that each chunk is relatively small. There's also a bunch of warp points. The way that you unlock them is by killing these shadow beasts, which is a lot better than just learning some song. Though I will say that it's kind of annoying that you can only warp as Wolf Link, since 9 out of 10 times you'll have to transform back into Human Link. There's not much else to say about it, so it makes you wonder why I said anything about the traversal to begin with. On to progression. Midna's pretty cool, right? What else do you want me to say? She's easily the best companion in the series and whatever everyone else says. Anyways, the opening of Twilight Princess is one of the most criticized parts of the game. Whilst I can definitely understand that, I don't really think it's that much of a problem. There's a variety of gameplay throughout here. Sure, not all of it is exactly thrilling, but I think that for establishing the narrative, it's the best opening in the series. It still has nothing on Kokiri Forest in terms of gameplay. I mean, you could get to the first dungeon in like 2 minutes in that game. Here, there's a lot of mundane tasks that you need to complete, but it allows you to get a really good idea of who Link is in this game and what his role in the world is, especially when compared to the Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time, where you don't get a good idea of who Link is. I mean, sure, in Wind Waker you kind of know Link's personality, but you don't know what he does on the island. Majora's Mask did a good job of establishing the world of Termina, but it's easy to skip that stuff in the opening, since the only thing that you need to do for the main quest that requires interacting with the world is a game of hide and seek. The stuff that you do during the tutorial in Twilight Princess is generally fine enough, though the goat herding stuff is not fun at all, and generally it's pretty unremarkable. The pacing of this game is pretty strange. There's the opening, which I've talked about. After that tutorial, you enter Hyrule Castle in wolf form. And once you get back from there, it's pretty consistent as to what you do for the next 3 dungeons. Do a Tears of Light section to free the land from the Twilight, a story section like following a monkey through the fog for the Forest Temple, rescuing one of the children from the opening of the game from King Bulblin, and defeating a Goron in sumo wrestling for the Goron Mines, and an escort on a wagon to Kakariko Village for the Lakebed Temple. Obviously, that's all oversimplified, but generally speaking, that's what you do. After the Lakebed Temple, Zant shows up and you get the Mina's Lament section, which is a pretty cool section. After that, what you do outside of stuff in between dungeons is wildly inconsistent. In order to get to Arbiter's Grounds, you need to visit Telma's bar in order to get told there's something strange about the desert, get launched over to the Gerudo Desert, wander over to the Bulblin Fortress, defeat King Bulblin, and enter the dungeon. For Snow-Peak Ruins, you catch a fish, walk down the linear path to a quick mini game, and you're at the dungeon. Then for City in the Sky, you have to find a cannon, go throughout the overworld and find a bunch of owl statues, go back to the cannon, get it fixed, and then get launched over to the dungeon. Then you pretty much immediately go to the Twilight Palace, and after that you immediately head over to Hyrule Castle. It doesn't sound too strange when describing it, but when actually playing, it feels really weird that before entering some dungeons you have to do a bunch of things in order to access them, and for some you basically just go straight to them. It results in the game not feeling as full as other Zeldas if you ignore the side content. I personally don't, but that doesn't make the main quest any more satisfying. It's still better than Majora's Mask though, I will say that much. The items in this game are really cool, but I don't really think that the game utilizes them to their fullest potential. There's the Gale Boomerang, which is a normal boomerang that has a tornado as well. It's used for removing these bridges with windmills on them, along with being used for these kinds of puzzles. The Iron Boots have been given a pretty big upgrade, being able to cling to magnetic surfaces. Unfortunately, the game only really uses this gimmick in the Goron Mines, and after the Goron Mines, you hardly ever use it. I mean, you do use them for a tiny bit in the Lakebed Temple, and you can drag switches down in the City in the Sky by weighing yourself with them. But outside of that, you don't really use them that much. There's a spinner, a really cool item that could have gotten more use with traversal. That gets hardly ever used in its dungeon. Like, I'm pretty sure that it was only used in like 2 rooms, which is such a waste. There's the ball and chain, which is so slow that it's never useful or fun to use. The Dominion Rod can control statues, but immediately after its dungeon it depowers, and after that you never really have a moment when you get to control a statue. There's these owl statues, but that's pretty much it. There's a horse collar you get, and it's useless considering how late you get it and how much more convenient warping is than riding on Epona. The hookshot's upgrade is that instead of having 1 of them, you have 2 now. It is unfortunate that you only get it towards the end of the game, but it's still a really cool upgrade that I wish got more utility. That's really the main problem with the items in this game. They're really cool, but they never get used properly. All things considered, this is the one 3D Zelda that has the most disappointing items. What little use they do get is still great though. Before we end this section, we need to talk about what is easily the most criticized section of the game, the Tears of Light. I can understand why most people don't enjoy it, but I personally think that they are actually kind of fun. They are most certainly not the highlight of the game, but I also think that there are much worse sections throughout the game. I enjoy them because it involves exploration of the area in order to find them. The bugs are highlighted on your map at all times, so it's just a matter of finding out how you're actually going to get to that location and then looking for the bug in that area once you get there. The only thing that I don't like comes at the end of Lanayru. After you get all the bugs in Lake Hylia, you'll notice that there aren't any more bugs here, so you'll look at your map and find out that one of them is in Castletown for some reason. Plus there's no reason why it would be there since you need to immediately go back to Lake Hylia for a mediocre boss fight. I really don't get it, since it kind of feels like they had a cool idea for the final tier section, but didn't know how to transition smoothly to that idea, so they just force you to go some other place and have minutes say that things are weird. Or maybe they just couldn't load the boss, so you need to leave the area so that can properly load in, which wouldn't really make sense all things considered, but maybe that's the case. Insert natural transition here. The quests in this game are pretty solid, but there's only one that really deserves mentioning, and that's the Mart quest. When I wrote this section, the only quest I felt like talking about was Mart, so here we are. The only real problem with the quest is that you need to be stupidly rich in order to complete it, and by that I mean you need to have 1,200 rupees. But with the golden bugs, it isn't too much of an issue. To start, you need to fix the bridge, and after that, the quest begins properly. The game has the most entertaining trade sequence in the entire series, and that's due to both the pacing and the fact that it's not a back and forth slog that goes on for an hour for no reason. You need to give a Goron some hot spring water in this timed quest where you can't drop a barrel with enemies surrounding you. It's a decently fun little sequence, and walking through the field is not as boring as it could have been since the path is relatively short and there's that sense of tension throughout the whole thing. Then you just donate a couple hundred to Mart and it's moved into Castletown. After that you can get the magic armor, which is what we like to call not good. It drains your rupees just by wearing it, which really doesn't make sense to me since why couldn't it just drain rupees when you get hit instead of draining your rupees just by wearing it? Maybe it's to make the rupees feel like they have more worth. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about Mart. This is the best time to talk about it considering that I have literally nothing else to say about the rest of the side quests in this game. Don't you love it when I waste your time? Next section. The The dungeons in Twilight Princess are incredibly overrated. Like, I enjoy the majority of them, but none of them really stand out as particularly memorable or great to me like with so many others. That's not to say that they're bad, in fact I actually like the majority of them, it's just that I'm the only morally correct person in this regard. The Forest Temple is a pretty solid first dungeon. As I explained in my Wind Waker video, the first dungeon should teach you about how the rest of the dungeons will function throughout the game. This one does that while still having its own identity. The main idea of the dungeon is that you need to rescue monkeys in order to progress through the rest of the temple, and it does that whilst also teaching you some basic puzzle solving. I particularly like this one where you have to notice where the monkey is and then burn the correct orb on the floor above so that you can fall through it and break the cage that the monkey is in. In fact, there are a lot of good yet simple puzzles throughout the dungeon, like using the Gale Boomerang to move this bomb enemy thing to blow up this rock. But let's get back to the motif since I can't stay focused for the life of me. I really like the motif of saving the monkeys, which is more fully realized than the Gorons from Ocarina. Saving them actually lets you explore more of the dungeons instead of just getting a key. It also doesn't feel like they drop the motif after you get the dungeon items, since you still need to save these monkeys to cross this large pit at the end, and the monkeys were never the focus of the puzzle solving to begin with. Ook, the mini-boss of the dungeon, is also quite fun, but there's really not that much to say about him. I will say that in terms of the narrative of the dungeon, it's pretty cool that he comes back to help you with the main boss. Overall, a strong opening. I love the aesthetic of Goron mines, the bloom type of effect that comes off of the lava, and the fact that it's a Goron mining facility is a nice way of tying it into the world that I like much more than how Dodongo's Cavern is tied into its world. That's kind of the highlight of the dungeon for me though. I guess there's this section here that sticks out in my mind for some reason, but that's about it. The main idea of the dungeon is collecting the broken apart boss key from the elders, but they don't really do anything with the idea. You just progress through it and get the shards from the elders as you progress down the linear path. There's no dungeon exploration to find them like they honestly should have been, so it's a wasted idea. There's these magnetic fields that suck you over to the wall or ceiling, which again is a cool idea, but they don't explore it to its fullest potential. They could have had some puzzles involving crossing these fields or something, but instead they just use it as a kind of transportation method, and you're so slow it takes away from some of the coolness of the idea. Dongoro, the mini-boss of the dungeon, is alright. It can be a bit hard to get a proper hit on him due to the janky controls, but he's still alright. It kind of reminds me of the Bowser fights from Mario 64, having to throw him off the edge of a circular platform. The only real difference between the two is that you don't throw Dongoro into bombs. There's not really much else to say about the dungeon. The Lake Bed Temple is easily the best dungeon in the game, at least in terms of puzzles. Although, as far as water temples are concerned, this is the weakest one by a landslide. It really stems from the main idea of the dungeon being a lot less interesting than the previous ones. Raising and lowering the water levels was utilized to its maximum potential, and it led to some tricky puzzles and more thoughtful progression. Changing the direction of the currents, while not really utilized for puzzle solving, was used for changing navigation through the dungeon in one of the most difficult, mind-stressing ways in the entire series. Lakebed, in contrast, does use its concept of sending water down the staircase to its fullest potential, but the ideas of what it could be used for aren't as expansive as the rest of the series. It's still a fantastic dungeon though. I like a lot of the puzzles in the dungeon, seeing which rooms have water wheels and gears and are stationary, and remembering where those rooms are when you get the water flowing towards that part of the dungeon are the types of puzzles that it excels at. But there aren't that many memorable puzzles outside of that. It's pretty straightforward so long as you remember where all the water wheels and such are, which is kind of a shame considering that getting back to those areas once you change where the water is flowing doesn't require as much brain power as the Water Temple or Great Bay Temple did. In those ones you had to think about the current state of the dungeon and how it was going to be changed, and how you could get to certain locations and planning around that change. There's a lot more map studying in those entries compared to this one, which is kind of a shame. It also carries over the long-standing tradition of having the most irritating enemies in the game. You got these jellyfish freaks that pose like zero threat whatsoever, but their existence really annoys me for some reason. These dumb clams that take forever to expose their weak spot. Helmosaurs, which are in my top 10 least favorite enemies list. They really take the concept of having enemies that are a pain to deal with until you get the dungeon item, which makes them a breeze a bit too far. You have to circle them in order to hit them from behind, but they don't stop moving, so you end up having to wait for several seconds. I know that doesn't sound too bad, but enemy encounters should be generally quick and snappy, and these ones are anything but. The Deku Toad is also just pathetically easy. I mean, the previous mini-bosses weren't exactly the hardest thing in the world, but they were at least fun. Here, though, you just do a couple spin attacks on the tadpoles or whatever they are, and then you just slam your sword into its tongue. Rinse and repeat. It's quite boring and not something that I can say I really enjoy. The temple is still great, it's just not as good as water temples of the past. Arbiter's Grounds is probably the most overrated dungeon in the series. I have heard from countless people how amazing Arbiter's Grounds is, and I would love to have an explanation for the love that this dungeon gets. The aesthetics are just the usual desert temple, and they don't really do anything to make it stand out from other desert temples. It's also inferior to Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple in pretty much every way. It is fair to compare these two, by the way, since they are both the fourth dungeon of the game and involve hunting down 4 puzzles. In the Forest Temple, before engaging in the fight, you had to do some small little puzzle first. Whether it was shooting an arrow into a painting or pushing some blocks together every time you wanted to face one, you had to find out how to get it out of hiding first. In this dungeon, however, you just kind of find them. The fourth Poe has another callback to the Ocarina fight, but much like what I've been talking about this whole time, it's inferior. In Ocarina, you needed to pay attention to which one spun around, which meant you need to be paying attention. Here you just need a way for him to attack you, making this whole cloning section feel like a way to waste your time. Plus, it's just kind of boring to traverse through. In the previous 3 dungeons, you always felt like you were progressing. Here, it just kind of feels like you're going in giant circles several times, since all these paths inevitably lead back to the central room. It just gets really boring. Plus, there are just some straight up not fun sections, like literally every time they shove these scarabs or ghost rats around you, slowing you down. It does nothing but aggravate me every few seconds. Despite all of what I've just said, I do like one single room in the dungeon. It's almost like a skate park, and I love just screwing around with a spinner in here. The mini-boss is also pretty fun. Death Sword, aside from his dumb name, is pretty fun. I like how the first phase involves Wolf Link and the second phase involves Human Link. The Wolf Link phase is a little too pathetic for my taste though, but the Human Link section is pretty fun. Timing your arrows to hit him can be a little tricky since he moves around a bunch. Not much else to say, just another fun mini-boss. Those are my only praise of the dungeon. It's bland mediocrity. Not the worst in the series, but definitely low in my rankings. Snow Peak Ruins is an amazing dungeon for 2 main reasons. Firstly, when progressing through the dungeon, it feels like you're actually moving through a mansion. It's the only dungeon in the entire game that doesn't feel like a random series of rooms. Everything here is thoughtful. That's not to say that the rest of the dungeons are well thought out, just that those ones felt like they are built out as the devs created more rooms, whereas this one feels like a dungeon was skillfully retrofitted into a mansion. The second reason is because of just how charming it is. The progression is based off of Yetta giving you the wrong location of where the boss key is. On paper, that could come off as really annoying and a waste of time, but here it's just so charming. Especially since instead of getting the key, you get ingredients for some soup, and every ingredient that you bring to Yetto increases its healing amount. I like the first half of the dungeon and how you need to think about how you transport these cannonballs to the cannons to break these ice barriers. Then you get the ball and chain, which is used in somewhat interesting ways. Not only can you break those ice barriers with it now, but you can also move these swinging platforms towards you. There's also Dark Hammer, the mini-boss of the dungeon, who is pretty annoying. The problem with the fight is that it takes place in a relatively narrow hallway. Avoiding his attacks and trying to attack him can be needlessly irritating because of this fact. He also has a greater range in Link since he's using the dungeon item. I don't really like him and he's easily the worst part of the dungeon. That's all there is to say about it. It's the best dungeon in the game and possibly the entire series, aesthetically speaking. The Temple of Time is a pretty cool dungeon with you having to solve both forwards and backwards. The design is really good since puzzles have to work when going towards the mini-boss, and then after that you have to be able to not only solve the puzzles in reverse, but you now have to account for this giant statue following you. Some of these puzzles are really good too. I like this one where you need to place a pot onto this switch to open one gate, and then break it in order to break a separate gate behind that one, and the balancing one is also pretty cool since you need to find a way to get this big one across the scales, I guess. The problem with the dungeon is that outside of these pretty good puzzles, the dungeon is pretty unmemorable. It's got a clean, white aesthetic, but compared to the rest of the dungeons in the game outside of Arbiter's Grounds, it doesn't really do enough to stick in my mind. The mini-boss is just an enemy, further compounding the issue. I like finding the dark nuts in this game due to the hidden skills, but having it be the mini-boss of the dungeon isn't exactly a purpose that they serve well. I enjoy the dungeon in the moment, and I love the puzzles, but outside of that, not much to say. The City in the Sky is an amazing dungeon. Firstly, there's the Uka. I adore these creatures. They're so strange, and sure, their design is that, but I think that they are legitimately one of the coolest new additions to the game. The gameplay utility that you receive from them is just the ability to warp out of dungeons, but I love that from the Temple of Time onwards you actually get to learn more about them as a species, like how they created the Dominion Rod and that they live in the sky. The dungeon doesn't really feel like a city though. The only thing that makes it feel anywhere close to some kind of village is the shop at the entrance. Despite the fact it's not really a city, this dungeon is fantastic. The puzzles are great, and you get to use the spinner. I like a lot of the things they do with the double hook shots, and the whole dungeon's focus on spatial awareness, like needing to locate a hookshot panel or something you need to hit. There's also these sections where you can float around with these ukas, and finding where you need to go also ties into this idea of spatial awareness. It's also probably the most overall difficult dungeon. I think that the overall progression was more difficult in Lake Pit Temple, but with the combinations of puzzles, navigation, and combat and sitting in the sky, it's pretty safe to say that it's the hardest one in the game. It also has an Aerolphos, a fine enough mini boss, I guess. It doesn't stand out and isn't offensively bad, but it isn't entirely that memorable. He's fine, I guess, but there's not much to say about him. I don't think that it quite lives up to the heights of Snow Peak Ruins or Lake Pit Temple, but it's pretty close. The Palace of Twilight is pretty cool. Firstly, I love the atmosphere. Everything is dark and creepy. The general motif is getting these balls of light back, and these hand scumbags gave me so much anxiety. Like, even Majora's Mask could never match the tension and stress of seeing this hand come after the ball. It's super fun trying to get through these sections as fast as possible before the hand comes and ruins your life. Unfortunately, that's the most notable thing about the dungeon. After the ball section is just a straight shot with the occasional stumping puzzle, and I do use air quotes around stumping, but it's pretty straightforward otherwise. The dungeon also doesn't have a proper mini-boss, and no, I don't consider Phantom Zan a mini-boss considering that you fight him multiple times. And the dungeon just feels a bit too short to be really satisfying. Hyrule Castle is so much better than Ganon's Castle from Ocarina of Time or Ganon's Tower from Wind Waker. The most notable thing with this dungeon for me personally is the completely optional small key that unlocks a room right before the final boss that gives you all sorts of goodies. Instead of having a series of rooms that are based off of previous dungeons that you've been in the game, it's completely original. Taking gameplay mechanics from earlier in the game, like crashing into these wooden fence things with a hog, a final fight with King Bulblin, this one room with Wolf Link, and utilizing your dungeon items, and using it as a sort of final test to see all that you've learned. The combat is also tested with several dark nuts along the path, and this one mini gauntlet at the beginning of the dungeon. I really like this final stretch as you climb up to the top of the castle. In the previous games, it was just a long staircase that, while definitely climactic, weren't really as interesting as they could have been. Here you need to use the spinner and your double hook shots in order to traverse up to the final room. There's even a part you can choose a path you want to go down, with one being harder than the other. It's the perfect climax of the game, and while I do like the idea that Ocarina had with its final dungeon, this one just flows with the rest of the game better in my opinion. There are a few bosses out in the overworld. There's the Twilight Bloat, the boss that comes at the end of the Nehru Tears of Light section. It's really easy, you just wait for him to attack you, dodge it, jump at it, then use this kind of area attack to destroy all of its legs. It's not fun and I hate it. The first one is a horseback combat section, which can be pretty fun, though catching up with him can be kind of annoying. Then you have this jousting section, which is all about the atmosphere. It's really easy. Even more easy is the second encounter where you shoot him with 2 arrows and he falls over the edge of the bridge. Then you have the other 2 encounters, which are more like proper boss fights. They're pretty fun one-on-one duels, especially since the game takes its time to establish a sort of rivalry between Bulblin and Link. I enjoy these fights though due to the hidden skills they are really easy, but he is intimidating enough, and if you do get hit it does a lot of damage. The bosses in the dungeons of Twilight Princess are all really easy, and they follow this really weird trend of having an okay or completely dismal first phase and having a really fun and exciting second phase. Diababa is a great example of this. The first phase is really easy, with you just having to take the bomb plant and get them to swallow it, blowing them up from the inside. But during the second phase, you need to time your throw, since the mini-boss from earlier is now carrying the only bomb plant of his own. It's still easy, but the fun factor goes up tenfold. You've also got Morpheal, whose first phase can be kind of annoying if you're not quick enough, since you need to take care of these bombfish and also see target its eye floating through the tentacles. It's not really fun or engaging, but then you get to the second phase where the whole monster comes out and it's this huge beast that you need to chase down in order to hookshot its eye and stab it until it dies. While not exactly difficult, the feeling of downing this huge monster is really good. There are also a few that aren't really noteworthy, like Fyrus, Blizzetta, and Armagoma, who are really easy and not really that fun to fight. Argarok has a really cool atmosphere, but lacks the satisfaction of defeating a huge beast. It's just kind of a fun boss with nothing else to add to that. The standout here is obviously Star-Lord. He is a ridiculously fun boss. The first phase is pretty fun since as it goes on you have all these enemies that bounce you in the opposite direction and you have to worry about these spinners. But the second phase is when it gets really good. Having a giant head shoot giant balls of energy at you, so you have to jump to the other rail on top of having to worry about these spinners too, trying to catch up with them. It's all just so much fun. Then you have Zan, who's pretty alright. I like how the room changes to previous boss rooms and the strategy changes based on which room it is. It keeps the fight engaging and dynamic, but oddly enough, it's one of the more forgettable fights in the series to me. I don't know why, I guess there's just nothing for my brain to really latch onto. Still a good fight though. Then there's the final fight, which is okay. The fight is split up into 4 phases and none of them are really anything special. The first phase is Puppet Zelda, or as I like to call it, Energy Tennis. If I'm being honest, I've never cared for energy tennis in previous games and I sure don't care about it here. They do try to change it up with a variety of attacks that you can perform, but they're also easy to avoid that it ends up dragging the fight out as you wait for the next ball to form. Then you have Dark Beast Ganon, and if I'm being honest, I think I prefer Breath of the Wild's boss of the same name to this one. This phase of the final boss is just not fun, and it's always the phase of the fight that I dread most when replaying the game. The first portion of the fight involves these portals, think Phantom Ganon from Ocarina of Time. Then he comes out of the portal, and you nail him on the head and slash his stomach. After a bit, you'll have to switch over to Wolf Link where you have to do the same thing, but when he comes near you, hold a button and throw him. It feels like an eternity before you get to move on due to how boring it is. I legitimately think this one phase alone is the worst part of the game, and I do actually mean that. Next, there's the horseback section where you just need to get close to him on your horse, and then Zelda will fire an arrow at him, and you attack him with your sword. It's not the worst thing in the world, but the problem here is that fighting King Bulbin was always much more involved with the player than this fight. Here you just need to be close to Ganondorf and you will basically be stunned immediately. There's no skill involved, leading to a section that is somehow easier than something earlier in the game, when it really should be the opposite. The final phase is a one-on-one sword duel with Ganondorf. I like the atmosphere of the battle, however it's probably the worst final battle in this series visually. Ocarina of Time's final duel was against a dark sky, Ganon's silhouette towering above you with brief flashes of light in the ruins of Hyrule Castle. Majora's Mask's final battle took place in a psychedelic rainbow room, with Majora being a very sporadic and having a variety of strange moves. The Wind Waker has water pouring in all around you, leading to a very cool looking final battle and my personal favorite visual ending battle in the series. Skyward Sword took place in this dark, hard to describe area, but it looks really cool and the focus is on you and Demise. There's no scenery to look at, it's all about the duel. And it looks just pretty cool as well. Breath of the Wild took place in the wild, enough said. Here, the sky just looks kind of dark and there's this circular barrier, but it looks really bland. It still looks kind of cool, but in comparison to the rest of the 3D games, it's the worst looking one by a landslide, at least in my opinion. The fight itself is also really easy and drawn out. It never evolves over the course of the fight, it stays the exact same. I will say though that when you do the ending blow on him, it is pretty satisfying, and not just because it finally ends the mediocre fight. Natural transition. Considering that so much of this video was actually complaining, I still adore this game. While it doesn't do anything that the rest of the series did better, like Breath of the Wild has the best overworld in the series, Majora's Mask has the best side quests, and Skyward Sword has the best dungeons, from memory, Twilight Princess has something that none of these other games have, and that's the best combination of everything that I love about Zelda. The story and overworld and side quests and dungeons blended together to craft the definitive Zelda game. And though it has its issues, I can look past them and enjoy the good things that this game has to offer. And next time in this retrospective, I'll be talking about Skyward Sword, a game I haven't beaten for 4 years, so I might need to retract all statements I made about Skyward Sword. In the next video, who knows? Like and subscribe or whatever other YouTubers say, and good.